Welcome back to my course, History of Socialism. Today I'm going to present you the second part of this lecture, which I started last time. The decline of socialism in Eurasia, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, and China. So last time we talked about the Soviet Union, the economy of the Soviet Union, the politics in the Soviet Union. And we also mentioned what sustained this regime, this inefficient regime that did not create any economic incentives for people to work hard. Essentially, the Soviet regime kept entire population on a welfare system. This provided a minimum support for the population, but at the same time people in general could not spread their wings to develop their talents, to rise up. We also mentioned that Soviet system did not provide any social mobility. It did not have any elections. It did not have any institutions that could guarantee the renewal of the system. For example, last time we talked about, I called it Walking Dead, the Soviet age leadership that did not ingest any new blood. By the early 1980s, the Soviet gerontocracy, it means the old leadership that was not renewed, was a symbol of the stagnation. So the fact that Leonid Brezhnev, that person who presided over the Soviet Union in 1960s, 1970s until 1982, this period became known in history as the period of stagnation. So this person, Leonid Brezhnev, who had 2 strokes, he had speech problems, his imagery symbolized the stagnation and degeneration of this inefficient Soviet system that cracked down on the freedom of speech, that did not have free elections, that did not allow people to travel in and out of the country, that wasted resources by supporting its numerous clients all over the world. All these things symbolized the decline of the system. But at some point after this leader died, Brezhnev, still the aged oligarchy that controlled the Soviet Union, they decided to at least instill some fresh blood, and that's when Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power. We mentioned that he tried to do glassness, openness. Glassness, the word glassness means openness. He tried to continue where Khrushchev stopped. It means he tried to de-Stalinize Russia. He followed these policies of de-Stalinization. So he did not attack like Khrushchev. He did not attack socialism, but he criticized Stalinism, okay? Because Gorbachev, I want to emphasize, matured during the period of reforms in the post-Stalin age, okay? So he picked up these ideas of reformed socialism, although he himself remained a committed socialist or communist. He believed in this system, but at the same time, he realized that the system somehow should be reformed. So it's a clear example how a true believer was tormented by this dilemma. So he pledged the loyalty to the socialist creed, but at the same time, he realized that this creed needed to be reformed. Okay, that is why last time I even compared him with sort of Martin Luther, who never gave up on his Christianity, of course, but at the same time he wanted to revolt against the Roman Pope. Okay, So that's what happened in this case with Gorbachev, who wanted to remain within this socialist matrix because nothing else existed for him, because all Soviet Union and entire Soviet educational system, a propaganda system, it for 70 years existed in the socialist bubble, so people were not exposed to any other ideas. So Gorbachev was part of this system, and he observed this system, he defended this system, but at the same time he realized that the system needed to be reformed. But since he didn't know any other ideas outside of the system, remember we said in the Soviet Union it was forbidden even to read the books that challenged socialism. Okay, so people were not allowed to read these books. So Gorbachev was part of this system, but he realized that the system needed to be reformed, right? So he wanted to reform this system, remaining within this system. Okay, and as it always happens when these true believers who want to reform this system, they pick up one or two bricks from the system, and soon the whole ideological structure of a particular creed begins to collapse. So that's what we have in this case, in the case of Gorbachev, who tried to reform the Soviet socialism that was based on this dictatorial rule of the Communist Party, because the Communist Party believed that it knew the way. Okay, so like frequently it happens in our history when people believe that they know the way, so they try to shut down all other alternative viewpoints, and that's what happened with the Soviet Communist Party. So they believed they knew the way. Okay, and as soon as this way was questioned, chipped away, things were chipped away from this system, and as soon the whole system was collapsing. Okay, and that is why I showed you this this picture, remember? This cartoon, you will see it. Yeah, this cartoon. I'm jumping ahead here, but I just want to visually show you what it was. Okay, so Gorbachev never meant to destroy the Soviet Union. Okay, for example, in the present day Russia, if you go to Russia, you will see a bunch of conspiracy theories, especially Russian nationalists, some Russian national communists. Communist Party in present Soviet Union is a very much identitarian organization, like many current leftist groups all over the world. Soviet Communist Party is very much identitarian, so it defends socialism and Russianness, so Russian nation, Russian culture, and all this stuff. So they blame Gorbachev in being a CIA agent, in being like a puppet of some Freemason Jewish forces that planted this guy with the purpose to demolish the Soviet Union. So but in the mainstream, in Russian mainstream, these conspiracy theories, if you go to Russian bookstores, you will see a bunch of books where Gorbachev is ascribed this malicious intentions that he was a planned American, Israel planned to destroy the Soviet Union. Okay, that is why I'm showing you this cartoon that describes best of all what in reality happened. So he never meant to destroy the Soviet Union. He wanted to reform the system of Soviet socialism, but in the process of reforms he destroyed this very system. Okay, so let me go back. Gorbachev gradually realized that you do need to give people some economic incentives. You cannot just control everything by the state. You cannot put entire society on welfare, okay, because it's killing. You cannot decree everything what people need to do in their local areas, okay. So he begins to, first, he allowed cooperatives, co-ops, So it allowed people to create cooperative societies, like euphemism, a cover for people in the Soviet Union to create private enterprise. But it was labeled cooperative societies, like an excuse, because he couldn't at first openly to say that, oh, I'm allowing private property, because it was like a violating of the socialist virginity. You know that the major enemy for radical socialism, it's a private property. It's like it's the major evil. You have to shut it down for a committed socialist. So they're very suspicious of private property. So he couldn't say it openly, but at the same time he realized that it needed somehow to exist. So that is why this euphemism was invented, so to give people a right to create cooperative societies. And soon people had this private dineries, restaurants, or private workshops where they repaired cars, car repairing workshops, or small textile factories which were labeled cooperative societies. Even cooperative banks emerged under Gorbachev. We also mentioned that he tried to challenge the Soviet patriarchal norms, so he involved his wife into politics, discussed openly with her political issues, and of course this antagonized this conservative Communist Party bureaucrats who didn't like this. They were very much male-oriented. What sustained the Soviet Union and communist system, and by default what sustained Eastern European communist countries, which received monetary help from the Soviet Union? Okay, we have to be clear about this, that the system, inefficient Soviet system, again, we want to emphasize this, the system was very much inefficient, because there were caps on how much money you could make. You know, if you wanted to make more money, you couldn't do it. So, but if you tried to do excessive black marketeering before Gorbachev came to power, you could be put in prison. If, for instance, you created some private diner, you couldn't do it. Physically, you couldn't do it because it was impossible. In the Soviet constitution, the private property was forbidden. But at the very end of the Soviet Union, before Gorbachev came to power, they did have underground private enterprise, like black markets, and some people illegally, from a Soviet viewpoint, at night employed some people who were manufactured some fashionable clothing. You can imagine. So the people had to go so far in order to kind of bypass the state regulations. But it was very dangerous, because these underground people who were involved into this underground economy, they had to bribe local police and Communist Party officials in order for them to exist. So potentially they could go to prison. So it's a lot of stress. So now you realize how much the Soviet consumer industry and industry in general was suffocated. Industrial enterprises received quotas, how much they could produce, how much they must produce, and no more, no less. So that is why local managers, socialist managers, they faked statistics, production statistics. And Soviet industry was not consumer-oriented, it was government-oriented. So socialist managers, they reported to the government, okay, because there was no profit motives. There was no price system in the Soviet economy. But again, I'm going back to the same question which I just posed, and we did discuss this last time. I simply want to emphasize again, since this economy, communist economy in the Soviet Union, and by the way, by default, we can extend what I'm just discussing to China and to other communist countries, socialist countries. I simply picked up the Soviet Union because it's the most vivid example of the socialist experience in action. Okay, so what allowed for this country to exist? And for other socialist countries like China that claim socialism, rich natural resources, as we said. And in case of China, it's rich human resources, exploitation of Chinese people when resources were extracted from the millions of people, and millions of people in China were to exist in miserable conditions. Okay, but in the Soviet Union, where the Stalinist practices were over in 1960s, 1970s, unlike China. So how could you sustain people if you didn't allow them to work productively? So you had to give them some kind of welfare. So in China, they didn't give people any welfare. So I repeat, in 1960s, 1970s, people lived a miserable life in China. So that was the major resource of the Chinese government, the human, this numerous population. They exploited in order for the Chinese economy to exist. But in the Soviet Union, this resource was exhausted by the time when Stalin was gone. So Soviets had to give the Soviet people something. You know? Okay. The money came from natural resources. Soviet natural resources, rich natural resources, oil, gas, gold. So government subsidized food prices, free healthcare, free education. Okay. But then when the oil and gas prices went down, and it happened in the middle of 1980s, I repeat, in the middle of 1980s, the prices for gas and oil went down. So Soviets lost this source of revenues. Okay. Plus, there was a devastating Afghan war, which the Soviets were involved in 1979, which drained billions of dollars of meager Soviet resources. So it was killing the Soviet economy. And plus, the United States was increasing military under Reagan. US government was increasing military budget, which also created this situation of competition. This although US military budget was only 9% of GNP, the Soviets had to spend up to 25% of their GNP to compete with the United States, because Soviet economy was weak, inefficient, so they had to spend much of these resources they received from selling oil and gas to cover their military. So, and eventually it completely destroyed the Soviet economy. Okay. So Gorbachev came to power, and he refused to sponsor Soviet satellites. He refused to feed these countries that received Soviet monetary help in Africa and Asia, that declared socialist orientation, like Angola, Ethiopia, Vietnam, Cuba. So he started to cut this financial help. He also decided to stop control of Eastern European countries, so Eastern European satellites. And he slowly started to shrink monetary help to these countries, because Poland, Bulgaria, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they used rich Soviet natural resources. Okay, and now Gorbachev, I repeat, tried to shut down this loophole. He decided to focus on the Soviet Union. And soon Gorbachev found himself fighting against the Soviet bureaucracy, which hated him for what? For criticizing socialism, so Soviet socialism, because Soviet bureaucrats were afraid that they might lose power. So Gorbachev didn't have enough resources and tools to control Soviet satellites. So soon he received this revolt in Eastern Europe. As soon as he started his reforms, saying that we need to criticize Stalinism. We need to give people some economic incentives to work. Okay, so it was used in Eastern Europe as an excuse to attack communism, and Poland was the first. Poland was the first to revolt against communism, because traditionally communism was hated in Poland, and Poland wanted to create an independent state. It was occupied by the Red Army troops, and the Polish people resisted until very late. Until 1948, 1949, there was resistance, underground resistance against the Soviet Red Army in Poland, and the majority of Polish population never accepted communism. And the Catholic Church in Poland was in charge of this revolt against communism. And ironically, their revolt against communism in Poland started as early as 1980, just before this old aged guy, Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, whom I mentioned, who had 2 strokes, died in 1982. So in Poland, there was a revolt of working class people. It's an irony of the situation. In Poland in 1980, workers in the northern Polish city of Gdansk created an independent union, because independent labor unions were forbidden in the Soviet Union, in Poland, and other communist countries, and of course in China. So it's even more. The most brutal dictatorship in 1970s still was China. So in Poland, 1980, working class people revolted in a shipyard. They tried to create independent labor union. They demanded what? Political liberties, freedom of speech. They protested against shortages, because Soviets were running out of their resources. They didn't have enough resources, food resources, to ship to Poland. And eventually the Polish government took credits in Western countries, and soon they had to pay back these credits. So they had no money to subsidize food prices, okay, to make a long story short. So shortages in stores, and again, regular communist practices of forbidding freedom of speech. So workers revolted against these 2 things. And the major demand was, allow us to create an independent labor union, independent of your government. And the government cracked down on this. And the solidarity movement actually expanded all over. It was underground movement. Soon there were 9 million workers joining this independent labor union. And the person, a grassroots person whom workers put in charge of this labor union, was Lech Walesa, an electrician from the shipyard in the northern Polish town of Gdansk. So again, I'm sharing with you this story because it's an irony of the situation. Supposedly a socialist state that was expected to do this dictatorship of the proletariat now found itself fighting against the proletariat, this industrial workers who revolted against the socialist regime in Poland. Okay, it's an irony of the situation. Even though this labor movement was suppressed by the Polish military, okay, in 1980, but still the job was done. A huge crack in the building of Soviet communism happened. And as soon as Gorbachev came to power in 1985, so this labor movement in Poland expanded. They resurfaced, and the Polish government didn't have any tools to control this movement, because now Gorbachev removed any support, okay, of the Polish military, Polish secret police. They found themselves without the Soviet support, because Gorbachev said, hell with you, do whatever you want in your countries of Eastern Europe, okay? Do whatever you want. And that was a signal for people to revolt and shut down this communist parties in Eastern Europe, okay? So in Poland, soon Solidarity labor movement turned into wide opposition movement, and they came to power in 1989. The Solidarity labor union came to power, and soon they allowed multi-party system. Okay, and Communist Party was gone. In Hungary, ironically, in Hungary, which was it was nicknamed the freest barrack in the communist camp. Hungary did allow, with the permission of Soviets, did allow some private workshops, private diners to exist on a limited scale under control of the government. At the same time, it was still a communist country governed by one communist party. Still, they allowed for some people to travel to the West on a limited scale. Okay. At the same time, Hungary was the Soviet ally. So this interesting position. As soon as Gorbachev lifted his hand and said, do whatever you want, Communist Party of Hungary shut down, abolished itself. So which shows that it was communism in Hungary was a Soviet imposition. Okay. In Czechoslovakia, there was a mass movement, and soon one of Czech dissidents, Václav Havel, came to power. In Czechoslovakia, Communist Party too disbanded itself. Eastern Germany was a tougher case. So in Eastern Germany, communism resisted until the very end, but the popular movement that said we want to do like in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, Gorby. So Gorbachev essentially became a symbol, became the symbol for these people in Eastern Europe to revolt against communism. Again, it's an irony of the situation, because Gorbachev wanted to reform the socialism in general, but in reality his name became a symbol to fight against not only communism but against socialism in general. So that's the irony of the situation. So people used his name as an excuse to fight, to revolt, okay, against this totalitarian system that had been imposed on them after 1945 in Eastern Europe. So soon the mass movement in Germany became so popular. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall was going down. Okay, so people destroyed this Berlin Wall. So it was the symbol of collapse of Soviet socialism and Eastern European socialism in general, November 1989. Only in Romania there was a bloody fight. Here, this Romanian dictator named Nicolae Ceausescu, he was independent of the Soviet Union, independent of the West. He was doing his own version of communism, national communism, trying to stay away from everybody, like isolationist. So here people tried to follow this general mood to revolt against communism, but he sent secret police and army against the people. So army joined the people, but the secret police decided to stay on his side, and for a few days there were bloody fights between the secret police and the people, and eventually angry people were able to prevail, and they seized him and his wife and executed him on the spot in a very brutal execution. Okay, that's because they again, a mob, essentially a mob justice on the spot, because they were angry at the secret police shooting people. So Gorbachev washed his hands and didn't want to do anything, because he was preoccupied with the Soviet Union, trying to navigate his course. Okay, and we will be talking more about the Soviet Union. But in the meantime, I would like to talk about China. What was going on in China? Interesting case, right? China's Communist Party was watching what was going on in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe. And by the way, in late spring of 1989, Gorbachev comes to China with an official visit. and the Chinese students go to the central square, Tiananmen Square, chanting his name, Gorby, 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 and they wanted freedom, which scared the Chinese leadership, okay? Scared. Let's talk about China. How did the biggest communist country responded to these challenges? I would like to take you back a little bit. Remember when we discussed China, we mentioned that until 1976, when I call him China's Stalin, Chairman Mao, Mao Zedong, this major Chinese communist leader who had his cult of personality, who was worshipped like Stalin. He was worshipped by his people, okay, who brutally controlled the country and kept the entire country in this misery. He had this great leap forward. Remember, an attempt to collectivize Chinese agriculture. 30 million people died. Then he had a cultural revolution, the Stalinist purges, right? 1.5 million died. So the Stalinist policies of extreme centralization, control, collectivization, the total economy of the country was totally wrecked. Okay? But he had this tug of war with the Soviets. Remember? He wanted to be the number one in the socialist world. And the Soviets didn't want to recognize him. There was a fight, a tug of war between two socialist countries. And trying to compete with the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong, stretched his hand for the first time to the United States. So he invited Richard Nixon to the United States, trying to use Americans against the Soviets. So there was a game where each side pursued its own goals. Mao did not dismantle his communism, but at the same time, geopolitically, he tried to play United States against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was afraid of this, okay? And then Mao dies. And the Communist Party divided in two parts. One, the left radicals who wanted to continue this Stalinist policies, and another group that wanted to reform the Chinese economy, who realized that the country was hungry. People had nothing to eat. No economic incentives. And that's when Deng Xiaoping comes to the picture. He took over after Mao died. Remember, Mao exiled him to the countryside in 1960s because Mao hated him. Mao believed that somehow this guy who wanted to create some economic incentives for Chinese peasants wanted to undermine his authority, because Mao was responsible for those reckless, devastating experiments in the country. So Deng Xiaoping comes to power, he takes over, he comes from exile, and he gradually, I repeat, since 1978, for 2 years, he had to fight against this radical leftists. It's Mao's wife and a few of his comrades who wanted to continue Stalinist policies of centralized control. So Deng Xiaoping eventually was able to defeat this group, and he was able to override Maoist and started to do what? Socialist market economy. So he decided to give people, peasants, some economic incentives. So what he did, on the one hand, he kept intact the entire communist system, so dictatorship of the Communist Party. It's a very important to stress. So the Communist Party control was rigidly preserved. But at the same time, he used his Lenin works writings about NEP, New Economic Policy. Remember, you needed to find some kind of excuses, since you were a socialist, committed socialist. You needed within this system of socialist books, you needed to find something to justify economic incentives he wanted to give to people. That is why Deng Xiaoping, he used Lenin's works about new economic policies. Remember, you needed to give some small economic incentives to peasants to work. All right? So we are Leninists. We are Marxist-Leninists, so we're okay. Deng Xiaoping declares socialism with China's characteristics. So that was his slogan. To pursue this goal, he declared so-called four modernizations. Four modernizations, it's modernization of agriculture, industry, military, and science. Okay. He didn't declare openly that we want to build a market. No, he didn't say it. He simply gave people, peasants, economic incentives, and also allowed people to create some consumer industry on a small scale, workshops to manufacture clothing and all this stuff. But primarily, it was the change in agriculture. All communes, Mao communes. Remember, Mao was creating communes where people were forced to work together, to eat together, sleep together. So all these communes were disbanded. All of them. By the turn of 1980s, they were disbanded, and Deng Xiaoping started talking about household responsibility. And the state enterprises were prompted to make profit. So now, trying to make profit. He also tried to modernize military, encourage scientists. Whatever visits US politicians made into China were used by Deng Xiaoping to do what? To expand relationships with the United States. So China realized that she needed technology. So she needed to modernize her economy. And she needed somehow to attract Western businesses. Deng Xiaoping goes to the United States, 1978. And he invites American businesses to come to China. And that's what attracted US government. So the US government decided to bring private businesses, private companies to China in hope that eventually it would somehow erode China's communist system. Okay? But the Chinese government needed technology. So needed somehow to feed their own people. So they singled out economic zones in coastal cities, special economic zones for foreign businesses, particularly from the United States, where major American companies, automobile companies or Coca-Cola plant and other, just examples, allowed to operate freely, and they had tax incentives. And the Chinese people were hired to work as cheap laborers. Okay? That was the beginning of this Chinese miracle, which we're talking about today. Okay? I'm jumping ahead here. Little did they know, the US governmental representatives, American businesses, that China did allow this free market to enter economy, but at the same time it was strictly regulated free market under tight regulation of the Communist Party of China. Okay? China's Communist Party never lifted grips of its own control of this economy. So NEP system in action, I'm going to talk more about it. And this desire to hold the grips over the political system increased when they were watching what was going on in Poland, the solidarity scare, the solidarity movement of the working class people, plus what was going on in the Soviet Union with Gorbachev, because they were very, very much afraid when Gorbachev said, we need to criticize Stalinism, we need some free space for people, free speech. People have to speak freely. So we need to lift censorship. So we need multi-party system. That's what Gorbachev that's what Gorbachev introduced in the Soviet Union when in 1990. And when in 1989 they observed the execution of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, this Romanian dictator, by the mob of people, they were really scared. The Chinese communist leaders, this oligarchy, were really scared. So they treated with fear Gorbachev and Eastern European reformers. They were petrified. Okay, so that's when Deng Xiaoping said, we need to stop this. It's getting out of control. So soon what this tide of reforms in political system might bury us. The irony of the situation is that in the Soviet Union, the market reforms did not kick yet, but the political reforms already destroyed the communist system when Gorbachev opened multi-party system, lifted censorship. But in China, it was reversed. In economy, down below, in economic system, in the countryside, we have peasants privately working the land plots. The land, of course, belonged to the government, but they worked their personal land strips. People were creating private dineries, okay, private workshops. Companies, American companies, were invited to operate in free economic zones. But in the politics and political system, it was tightly controlled communist system in China. Okay, and here we go. Gorbachev visits China in 1989, and thousands of Chinese students come to greet him. Gorby, and some of them, by the way, in addition to shouting Gorby, 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 they carry the effigy of American Statue of Liberty, and they wave American flags. So don't forget that I told you that in many parts of the world, I don't know about you here again, but in many parts of the world, the American flag, American Statue of Liberty is treated as a symbol of freedom. And in Hong Kong recently, when students protested against communist dictatorship of China, they waved American flags. Okay. In Philippines, when people were in Philippine Islands, and number of years ago when people were fighting against the regime, also carried American flags. And the Soviet Union, the same thing. Anyway, even in present-day Russia, there were demonstrations in Moscow against Putin's regime. People demonstrated carrying some American flags, like not only American symbols, but also some "Don't Tread on Me" flags. Again, it did happen in Russia 2 years ago, last year. But anyway, I made a detour, so let me go back to China. So young Chinese students and young workers go to the central square, Tiananmen Square in China, 1989, to demonstrate for reforms. Give us elections, because you know in China to the present day they don't have elections. Okay, the political party belongs to the Communist Party. I will jump ahead a little bit. Even more so today, because under Deng Xiaoping said, so we need this Communist Party needs to elect, the communist leadership, this oligarchy need to elect from time to time the general secretary to be in charge of the Communist Party. But in 2017, the Chinese Communist Party changed the rules, and now they declared the present day general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, 2017, the lifelong leader. So they even violated this rule that was introduced by Deng Xiaoping in 1970s, that the communist oligarchy should each 8 years at least should elect a new communist leader. Okay, now it's a lifelong leader, so the grip's even tighter right now. Anyway, China didn't have elections at that time, no freedom of press, no freedom of speech. Okay, and that's what attracted Chinese students in the Soviet reforms. And Gorbachev when he saw this, when he came to see it, he said, "Oh, I came to Beijing and you have a revolution." And now the Chinese leadership realized they made a mistake inviting him, because it was an excuse for dissidents to go and demonstrate. So China was scared of rising anti-communism in the Soviet Union and East Europe. There was a debate when Gorbachev was in Beijing. There was a debate between two groups in the Chinese communist oligarchy. What to do with these students? Thousands of students were at the square called Tiananmen Square. See, that's the name, Tiananmen Square. Thousands of students and young workers. The group of reformers said, we need to reform like in Soviet Union. But the majority, including Deng Xiaoping, said, no, you cannot allow this. This, as I said, this tide would sweep you away. So eventually conservatives in the communist leadership prevailed, and Deng Xiaoping himself prevailed. He said, we need to call in the troops. And the troops were called. Tanks, secret police, army were brought to Beijing, and they were ordered to shoot at the demonstrators. So to use tanks against the demonstrators. And thousands of people were killed. And in the one day, everything was over. So tanks were literally riding over people. Soldiers were shooting at these demonstrators. It was a bloody massacre. So it became known as Tiananmen Massacre of 1989. In China, to the present day, it's forbidden. It's forbidden to mention it. So you could be jailed if you begin openly to talk about this. You know, Chinese students who are here in the United States, they're scared even when you, for instance, see a bunch of Chinese students, like 5 or 6. They're scared to talk openly about it. Why? Because they're afraid there's some secret police informers among them who might report them. Okay, even in the United States, here in the United States. So you cannot even mention this incident. Okay, it's like something that never happened. All right, to the present day. That's an interesting thing. So thousands of people killed. We don't know exactly actually how many people were killed. So this picture, I would like to show you this picture. So this picture, thousands of copies of this picture at that time, 1989, before this massacre started, was printed and reprinted in Time, Newsweek, and all kinds of newspapers in the United States, in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, this picture. And it's a very important picture. I will explain to you why I would like you to kind of remember about this picture. Okay, it's a very symbolic picture. So essentially, if you look at the close range at this picture, you will see who is here. On the one hand, we have the tanks with the red stars sent by the Communist Party against whom? Against the regular people. Who wanted what? Who wanted to be consumers? Who didn't like shortages in stores? Who wanted freedom of speech? What does this guy carry in his hand? Okay, a few investigative journalists later did a close-up and looked what he carried. He carried a bag, a shopping bag. Again, having my personal experience of life in a communist country, I'm telling you, it was an essential part of your daily attire. So when you went somewhere, you carried a big, tight, durable shopping bag. Why? Because you never knew what you could catch in a store. Maybe by chance you could buy something which was not unavailable. You didn't know. It could be a pair of shoes, it could be a small chunk of cheese, or it could be some a bit of sausage. It could be some a screwdriver, which was not widely available in stores in communist countries. It could be magnetic cassette for a tape recorder. Okay, it could be a box of chocolate candies. Again, all these items were not regularly available. You couldn't buy them anytime. You had to hunt them. So China was still a communist country. It was not yet what you can see today, of course. In Chinese stores, you can see a bunch of goods. Okay, of course, you don't have freedom of speech, you don't have elections, you don't have free press, but you have everything in goods. The other reason people don't have money to buy this stuff. But at that time in China was still a full-fledged country where many consumer goods were not yet available. So basically you can see a regular guy with a shopping bag who faces the tanks, and that's what it was. So it's a very symbolic picture. Okay, a small regular guy, just, of course he didn't think this way, but you can read here, at least I can read a lot of symbolism in this picture. A small little person who simply wants to be left alone, who wants to buy things, who wants to live his or her life without being imposed by the state or some proponents of quote-unquote justice, so how you should live your life. Okay, it's a very, please remember this picture. At least I don't know about you, but to me it's a very meaningful picture. It's a basically confrontation, a big state that tries to impose something on us, and on the other hand, just a regular person who said, leave me alone, I don't want you to interfere into my life. Anyway, going back to specifics of Chinese economy. To make a long story short, that's what China right now. So since that time when the movement of the students in Beijing was brutally suppressed, a lot of people were literally executed, China was frozen in time and space, and that's what China is right now, to the present day. Look at this pyramid, and that's what it is. It's kind of NEP, New Economic Policy, Lenin's New Economic Policy in the kind of present day reincarnation. Okay, essentially what we have, it's a state capitalism in China. The Communist Party holds all commanding heights, political power, major industries, banks, aviation industry, the commanding heights in foreign trade. The big companies, by the way, big companies, don't be fooled by these Alibaba, Huawei, these big companies. They are not Western companies in our sense. These companies are headed by people who are appointed to become quote-unquote capitalist. These people are members of the Communist Party. So if they don't do what the Chinese Communist Party orders them to do, they will be kicked out. So it's a state-appointed capitalist. So you should remember about this. I don't know if this newspapers or whatever you read, tell you about this, but that's what it is. And if you see the name of a big Chinese company, always remember, these are not free. That again, I don't know the name who, for example, is in charge of Huawei or Alibaba company. Okay, but these are not Sergey Brins from Google. These are not Mark Zuckerbergers. These are not these guys who are in charge of Twitter, okay, who are free to do whatever they want, even to control our life. It's another issue, of course. But at the same time, as I said, so remember about this, that all Chinese companies, these big companies, they have to be obedient to the Chinese government. But at the same time, free market is allowed in agriculture. So peasants are allowed to work on their personal farms, although the land belongs to the government. That's the irony of the situation. Okay, don't be fooled that Chinese peasants are not American farmers who have their farms as private property. No. The land belongs to the government in the Chinese countryside. They only hold the land, but they have their personal family strips where they can work, they can freely sell their produce, everything is fine. They can hire workers, everything is fine. There are some private factories in China. Yes, but they exist with the permission of Communist Party. A bunch of all restaurant business in private hands, in of course in China. So it's all in private hands if you travel there. So small industry, agriculture, all in private hands, but the commanding heights in the hands of Communist Party and secret police. Secret police. Let's go back to the Soviet Union to see. So what was going on in the Soviet Union in the meantime? So we just parted with Gorbachev when he presided over the Soviet Union that was going down under his leadership, although Gorbachev believed that he was reforming socialism. At the same time, he was killing socialism. The fact that reforms of Gorbachev were undermining the communist system upset conservatives, communist conservatives in the Soviet leadership, and they organized the coup d'etat against him, so revolted against him. Nomenclature, remember Soviet nomenclature. In China, nomenclature won the battle. Okay, the nomenclature won and said we are going to be in power, and they solidified their power, Deng Xiaoping. But in the Soviet Union, nomenclature was divided: reformers who followed Gorbachev and conservatives. So conservatives in 1991 revolted against, made an attempt to revolt against Gorbachev. They put him under house arrest, trying to do something what nomenclature had done before with Khrushchev. Remember, we talked about Khrushchev 1964, when Stalinists who were afraid of Khrushchev criticism of cult of personality, Stalin cult of personality, they revolted against him and they deposed him, forced him into retirement. And that's how this period of stagnation started. Remember, in the beginning I mentioned this guy with big eyebrows, Brezhnev, who presided over period of stagnation, 1964 and 1982. So now they tried to play the same game, the same trick with Gorbachev. But the circumstances were different right now. They arrested him, but it triggered the mass revolt of Soviet people. People spontaneously in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, revolted, went to the streets. They built barricades. All kind of alternative groups, from anarchists to right groups, nationalists, everybody went to the streets to fight against this coup d'etat. Okay. The coup d'etat was organized by the Soviet secret police and by the military. They sent tanks to Moscow to surrender the parliamentary building where Russian parliament, newly elected Russian parliament, was sitting. Because Gorbachev allowed, remember, multi-party system, and under this multi-party system, local parliaments were elected in many Soviet republics. There were 15 of them, remember? So Russian Federation, the biggest Soviet republic, had its own parliament, and the parliament became the major force to conduct these reforms. So anyway, tanks were sent, but the people built barricades, and soon the army refused to go against people. So army refused to go against the people. So in China, army did shoot at the people on the orders of the Communist Party. I guess in China, communism became more ingrained, but in the Soviet Union, although Soviet Union was the cradle of communism, here people were so fed up with the system, so nobody wanted to fight for the Soviet Union, for communism. Army refused to go against the people, and they started to hug people, and soon there was a bunch of celebration, the street festivities, when people were hugging soldiers, and the whole coup d'etat evaporated. Okay. Gorbachev returned from exile, but he already found himself the person who was in charge of the country that was falling apart, because these 15 republics, local republics in the Soviet Union, look, 15 republics in the Soviet Union, they created their own parliaments, they elected their own leaders, and the Russian Federation also elected her own leader, named his name was Boris Yeltsin, also Communist Party guy who revolted against the Communist Party. So he decided to be kind of part of the movement, grassroots movement against communism. So he was elected to be the leader of Russian Federation. Kazakh people seceded, elected their own leader. Ukraine elected her own leader. And the Baltic, 3 Baltic republics already seceded, openly seceded, didn't want to stay inside of the Soviet Union. They simply seceded. When Gorbachev still was in power, they already seceded because they were European countries, and they said, we were occupied in 1945, we didn't have with you anything at all, so they left. They had their own leaders. And Gorbachev, again, found himself the person without a general secretary, without any communist party, without any country, and he had to step down because the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was simply disbanded, okay. People didn't accept this coup d'etat, and national elites in all 15 republics, they tore apart the Soviet Union, okay. And that's how communism was disintegrating, Soviet Union was falling apart, and that was the end. That was the end. And globally, I would like to tell you that unlike the present day situation where we have a small renaissance of socialism, in fact, not in all countries, but I don't know how long it will last, but we have a small renaissance in the United States, in England, not in France, because in France, like in the Soviet Union to some extent, people were so much fed up with this socialism, because socialism had been embedded in French culture, so there was a strong movement against socialism in France, by the way. But still we have a small renaissance right now. But at that time, 1980s, 1990s, there was a strong movement against socialism. So even mentioning the word socialism was not popular. So many communist parties dropped the names. They dropped the name communist, socialist. They started to call themselves labor parties, progressive parties, or people's parties, this type of euphemisms. So globally at that time, socialism was going down. India, for example, abandoned the elements of socialism. India, of course, it was a democratic country which had absorbed part of the British constitutional tradition, which was good. But it also had state-supported enterprises, okay. Communist Party was popular in India. So these things were going down. For example, Indian government privatized state enterprises, 1991. In Tanzania, remember we mentioned Tanzania, Julius Nyerere decided to drop African socialism, Ujamaa. It happened right in the middle of these changes which we are discussing right now. The collapse of Soviet Union, this collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. So African socialism was dropped in Tanzania. Egypt kicked out Soviet military advisors, and any talk about Arabic socialism was dropped. Nicaragua, Cuban-supported country, for the first time had free elections, 1990, and also abandoned socialism. Vietnam, that had indigenous communism fighting against the United States. Even in Vietnam, communism was out of favor, out of popularity, and Communist Party started to switch from communism to state capitalism, something like what we have in China right now, the capitalism controlled by communists, so NEP, New Economic Policy. So that's how communism and socialism in general was collapsing on these vast spaces of Eurasia. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you